Current time is now 7:21 p.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. It's time for Made in Korea with Professor John DeMoya from Seoul National University joining us in the studio. Professor DeMoya, good to see you again.
Thank you very much for having me.
You are a very happy person today, as we saw, because first thing he said when I saw him during my short break outside was, Embiid is back.
Which was the meme on the internet where Embiid held up a little piece of paper saying, I'm back.
Well, you know, in maybe about less than a year, I'm going to be just going, I'm very happy too, Professor DeMoya, because Embiid is a Knick.
We'll see.
There's
it's a possibility. I acknowledge this, but I think Joel is a loyal... Not native Philadelphian, a long-term resident.
Sure. He's as loyal as Ben Simmons was with the Sixers.
Okay.
We're going to do part two
of
what really is one of the darkest history in Korea. And just yesterday marked the 76th anniversary of the April 3rd Jeju incident. There's different wordings to this particular incident. The one that Arirang likes to use is Jeju incident.
Yes.
There's others that use uprising.
Right, and I think that language has been moved away from specifically because that has more of a leftist, violent, without explanation.
Right.
Where incident is can be more historically unpacked.
Yeah, so uprising basically means, people that were against the government,
unjustified
and things like that. I've heard
it's probably an older language,
right? And I've heard Jeju massacre, which I think could certainly describe what happened.
That also has come up more recently. Yes.
So today we're going to be talking about the April 3rd incident, and if that happened in 1948 through 1949, why it took so long for this particular history to be known. We're going to be talking about what dark heritage or dark history is and how historians approach this and what changes to allow for a different discussion of Jeju and where does that understanding stand now. The April 3rd incident, again, I mean, we've mentioned it yesterday. It's not something that happened on a single day. Right?
No,
and that's
the
the
April 3rd
misunderstanding.
is signified and used because that's the marking of the start point.
Yeah.
But no, in fact, if we're talking about just the rollout of the incident, not the implications, what's continued to today, it's at least a year and a half going well into April or May of 1949.
April or May until 1949.
So more than a year.
So more than a year you're looking at.
Yes.
And you could kind of imagine, because for many people out there, they go, well, I mean, if there's a single date, I mean, it must be something that happened on a single date. And how did so many people die on a single date?
Right.
But no, this is, again, over a year long incident here. I want to ask you how the outbreak of the Korean War, again, this is something that happened in 1950 to 1953, changed the U.S.-Korea relationship as opposed to how the relationship was, again, just around this time.
Right.
Prior to the Korean War.
While the relationship officially during the occupation and in the immediate period of transition to the South Korean government is officially good, it's clearly, and we know this now historically, much more problematic. Exactly things like this incident. Other cases where Americans replace Japanese officials and Koreans treat them very ambivalently because they're not sure, if I'm free, why are you still here?
Right,
A much more complicated relationship. With the outbreak formally in late June of 1950, that is going to provide motivation to not talk about any questions to the relationship. And then, of course, as the war rolls on and the U.S. Koreans do fight together, famously getting pushed down to Busan and then pushing back, the relationship becomes sufficiently solid that it kind of paves over some of the cracks and fissures from 46, 47, 48 like this, so that not only do you not want to talk about them, you probably politically can't talk about them, particularly as you go into the post-Korean War period where South Korean government doesn't want to ever bring up the idea that there was ever any issues with the U.S.
Yeah. Again, I mean, we'll talk about in just a bit and why this took so long for people to shed light on this particular incident. How does Jeju 1948 possibly offer a different understanding of the war in terms of its timeline and in terms of its underlying causes?
Sure. At least two things. And as you pointed out rightly, it's right. It's both cause and also temporal. In terms of time, it extends the timeline. Some historians, and I don't think this is yet taught probably in high schools, but maybe in universities, are starting to say that as early as the arrival of the Americans in September 45, the Russians in the north in August 45, you have the cracks and fissures for a north-south divide already happening there. Yeah. So some historians will call it like 45 through 53, 4 or 5 years of a relatively peaceful but nonetheless extremely tense. But the forces in place for the war are already there. And then they'll call the second part of the war the officially declared war. But that will extend the timeline to, as opposed to the old narrative of 3 years, much more like an 8-9 year time period, which makes it much longer and much more complicated. And then, as you said, in terms of causes, the recognition that it's not black and white. It's not all dark communists up north. It's not all good, free world loving people down south. As we know, to even complicate that off the top, lots during 45-46, when migration was possible across the border, of the Christians who were in Pyongyang, which was originally the Jerusalem of the East, are migrating south. There are, we're allowed to say this now, a small number of people who go north voluntarily, who are generally speaking ideological artists, scientists, people who believe that that is a better form of revolution. So that what the way historians will describe these two things put together now is the circumstances were already there in 45 for a civil conflict. The arrival of the Americans and the Russians increased that polarization over several years to the point where it later takes on the appearance of kind of a much more stark black and white contrast.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because you're right. It's usually the artists and scientists who want change, right?
Yeah,
and that's what.
And we know that Kim Il-sung recruited these people to help build the early North Korean state.
Oh, absolutely, and that's what it looked like, because they were saying, the way that Kim Il-sung was kind of pushing for this is, listen, look at how we lived under the the colonialization of the Japanese, and we need change, and as we know, poverty is all over the Korean society right now. We're recovering from Japan leaving. We need change, and change was the big thing, right?
Yeah, and if I can tack on to you, the one specific thing that I've heard people talk about that was probably most appealing if you bought the Northern rhetoric at that time was land reform.
Yeah.
The South, with Lee Sung-man coming in, is probably going to favor, without pushing it too far, people who are a little bit wealthier and not a great deal of land reform. The North is actually going to a great extent, at least in the early years, offer land reform. And if you are worried about poverty and things like that, you may very well be listening to this narrative and saying this is the way to go.
Oh, if you think about, number one, the big problem with communism is that there is no perfect communism, right, in the society. It's always been ruined with, the dictatorship and things like that. But also, it's not really fair when you say that everyone gets an even share of everything, right? So even if you're a doctor, and you have
of course, the realities play out much more.
Yeah, it just doesn't work out.
There are class structures in communism just as well as anywhere else.
But that's not how they're going to show this.
No,
they're going to say that, listen, this is the way to get out of poverty. We share the goods and we share the wealth, and that's the way to go out. But another point that you made is the fact that, again, you have these other outside influences, right? You have the Soviet Union.
Correct.
You have the United States who are kind of pushing this. And so even amongst the Koreans, there's this crazy hate for those, even amongst just the Koreans, those who are with the communists and those who are not with the communists. And there's this big thing. And this is why we're, again, the people of Jeju were falsely accused of being communists, and this is
some were, but again, that doesn't necessarily mean you're North Korean. It means you're communist and you are a Korean nationalist, probably.
Right, exactly. And so this is how things panned out. But what is a difference between a civil war and an international war? Because this, in some ways, seems like a civil war.
Yeah, and this very nicely maps onto what we're talking about.
Yeah.
To give you some names to identify with it, for a long time, at least when I was in the States growing up in the high school in the 80s and further, it was always called more of an international war or connected to the Cold War, the idea being that the Soviets and the Americans were the primary actors.
Right.
The Civil War, which as you've suggested, is much more about giving the two Koreas agency, telling the domestic narrative, recognizing that the local actors were more important. That narrative would be more closely associated with the work of someone like Bruce Cummings, who was one of the first people to kind of write about this early on in the 70s and 80s. The International War is famously now associated more with, I think he's retired, but William Stoic at Georgia. And I think Stoic is more soft, where he now tries to compromise and say things like, well, yes, it was a civil conflict, but it was overlaid with the arrival of those two parties.
Yeah.
But again, the reason the Civil War is so important is it really places the Korean actors at the forefront of the activity, recognizes that, yes, it was during the Cold War. Yes, there were these major superpowers, but ultimately it was about Koreans trying to determine their own fate.
It's so complicated, right? That when you're talking about, because on the outside it just seems like a civil war. It seems like it's just a battle between the then Korean government, right, under Lee Seung-man, and the people in Jeju. But you talk again the outside influences, and there's.
And that's still going on today.
Yeah, and there's people that say, no, I mean, it's ultimately Lee Seung-man and his people that made the decision here. Some people are saying, well, I mean, listen, but, who pushed them towards that way?
Does the American occupation have a role?
Yeah, and a lot of people are saying that if there was no American occupation that took place, this certainly would not have happened, and then it gets very political, because this is where now right-wing...
I was just going to say, it now nicely maps onto the current Korean political divide. Sure.
Exactly.
Sure.
I want to know, because it's been 76 years since the start of this Jeju incident. But as we mentioned earlier on, this is not something that was talked about.
No. I suspect you couldn't for a long time.
Oh, no, absolutely not. But when and how did the Jeju incident start finally coming out?
Yeah, I think publicly it has to be associated with post-democratization, post-87. A couple of specific incidents. I believe as late as the early 90s, even post-democratic, there are reports of, so it would be, I always get the names confused, No Tai Woo, still actually covering over some of the caves at Hala where the atrocities took place, because he doesn't want to talk about it. But Kim Dae-jung mentions it in his administration in the late 90s. And then more specifically and more famously, not surprisingly, more middle to center-left Korean governments bring it up, especially No Moon-hyun in the early 2000s.
Right.
And they will actually start investigating. And I think at that point, roughly 15 years into democratization, 2002, 2003, you can, I wouldn't call it necessarily discern the truth, because it's still controversial, but you can actively investigate it and talk about it. And that particular government will offer a formal apology in 2003, saying that we don't know exact numbers, but people were killed, and this was definitely a byproduct of the Lee Seung-man government essentially attacking its own people.
And this is... And many people say because it was in 2003, and this means that, Lee Seung-man is nowhere around.
Right, long past, somewhere in 65, I think he passes away.
In Hawaii, I think, right?
Yeah.
He wasn't even in Korea.
No.
It's a liberal government.
This is exactly where the accusation will go. Sure,
right, so the liberal government who makes the apologies here. And so there is still this sort of idea that they haven't been properly apologized, right?
Sure.
Because
if you are more on the side of still doing more digging, yes.
And
the U.S., by the way, has never said anything. That's the real strong Korean human rights activists will say that they're waiting for some form of recognition that the American occupation bears some responsibility.
No, I think there's some people. I think many people do believe that there must have been some sort of influence, right? I mean, you can't say that the U.S. had
actively
no
or passively
influence.
they knew what was going on.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So you can't say that they had no influence whatsoever, because
it's a question of the degree they bear for. Why did they not intervene?
Exactly. And so we talked about how proper apologies being made here, and then was there proper apologies being issued by, let's say, conservative government and things like that. And it's really unfortunate because it's become a political issue. There's still even people here in Korea who believe that what happened in Jeju for more than a year was reasonable. There are people who are saying that. I mean, there's just basically, there's this fear of communists.
I was just going to say, I can see a narrative. I personally do not subscribe to it, but I can see a narrative where it's before the Korean War. There is a popular/communist uprising. It needed to be suppressed.
Yeah. However, though, I think we can clearly say that for the most part, though, that both ends of the political parties do acknowledge the fact that it is a dark history.
Yes,
in Korea.
something that, and right, to define dark history, outside of Korea, the famous case is the Nazis. We know this happened. How does the Germans address it? Similarly, how do Koreans address things in their own history that everyone acknowledges happened, but how do you come to terms with it? More importantly, how do you teach it? How do you represent it in museums? I think this is a perfect example of something that's still being worked out. There's no single narrative that everyone can agree upon.
Right. So, which is why, because yesterday was the 76th anniversary of this particular start of this particular incident, you had the party leaders of both rival parties who went down to Jeju to pay tribute.
This makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
sure.
exactly. I mean, because it is a fact in history that, for most part, we have accepted that it was wrong. Okay, and that's why.
That there was excess. Then the question is how the degree of excess, and certainly there's still dispute about the number of people who were killed over the period of the year.
Exactly, and still even that is
right.
We don't know. Are there any other incidents in Korea, maybe even like the East Asia region, that offer a context for this particular event?
Yes, absolutely. And a couple examples, both in Korea and then also outside, roughly the same time.
Sure.
During that year, and I apologize, I forget the exact month, but it's got to be late 48. There's the Yosu, incident, rebellion, uprising. But similarly, there are demonstrations of popular violence, usually in the southern part of the peninsula, 47, but this one in 48, that also, like Jeju, reflect that there are people who clearly don't like the Lee Seung-man government who are labeled as communist, and then there's a debate about what that means.
Right.
And similarly, they're a smaller scale, but they're put down. Outside of Korea, less famous, but certainly, I think, relatively good in terms of serving as comparison. The Hook Rebellion in the Philippines, which probably is not known in East Asia, but immediately after 45, Japan leaves, America comes back to the Philippines, and then they're going to offer them independence. There is a uprising of left/communist. I can't do the full word in Tagalog, but Hook is the shortened version. And the Philippine government puts it down, so it's not widely known outside of the Philippines, but I imagine still talked about controversially there. And then one more, Taiwan. If you know the 228 incident in February 47, there's a black market. The Kuomintang puts it down, and this becomes the famous white terror that rules Taiwan through the 80s, like Korean militarization, so that now Taiwanese can talk about it as, well, why was the government so harsh? Why did they have to be this strict for much of the Cold War?
It's everything is shaping up. Now, one of the things that when I first came to Korea, one thing that I didn't understand, remember, Korea is known for its rallies. Political rallies.
It's one of the things that makes this place great.
Right. And most of the time it's done in a very peaceful way. When I first came to Korea and I saw a group of conservatives protesting against a liberal government, that they started waving the American flag.
Right. As you will see here often now.
As well as the Korean flag, obviously. And I never understood why back then, right? Why the conservatives in Korea, Korean conservatives, are waving the American flag. But all of this kind of dates back to what happened pre-Korean War, right? Again, this idea that
the alliance justifies...
Right, and the occupation of the United States at the time was justified in order to kind of further push away...
Korea was in a very precarious situation. If you buy this narrative, the U.S. helped us, we should not question that help. We should not question some of the consequences of that help.
Although, don't misunderstand this, that the liberals believe that they don't like Americans, then that the liberals
I don't want, I don't want to push it the other way.
Right,
I'm just saying the conservatives have a more interesting narrative in terms of how they present, and it's almost always associated with the flag, Lee Seung-man, and you'll see pictures of Park Chung-hee aligned with each other.
Yes. I want to know, though, and we've kind of briefly mentioned how an apology was eventually issued.
Yep.
Many, many decades later on. But we've had after democracy was achieved in Korea in the late 80s, and we've had a number of different administrations moving forward, how the later Korean governments sort of approached this incident.
It's interesting because I mentioned, so it's a perfect time to mention the second one. The ones that I know that have been sort of official, 2003, No Moon-hyun was very open about it with following the inquiry of the committee. My understanding is that in 2019, with the Moon Jae-in government, wasn't the government formally, but the police and I believe even some part of the military may have said something similar along the lines of, well, our participation in putting this down was excessive. We acknowledge our role in the violence.
Wait, which government?
Moon Jae-in.
Oh, the Moon Jae-in group.
Yes.
Okay.
So not surprisingly, it has tended to be more liberal, left of center Korean governments that have been more open about it. As you said, other governments, I think, have at least acknowledged by sending representatives down there and acknowledging the Jeju people. They might not buy into that same narrative of apology, but they certainly recognize that it's something that is of great interest popularly, and that being there politically can have certain kinds of advantage to yourself.
Right, and so if there is no appearance being made by, let's say, a certain figure of a political party, it looks bad on them.
Yeah,
right? Which
is why
you
ignore it at your risk.
So I think that's the reason why the DP was also attacked when there was, we have the general elections coming up next week.
Which I'm very aware of. Though.
Yeah, and so you have different debates, and I know that one of the debate issues that was brought forth by a DP lawmaker, DP candidate for the upcoming general elections in Jeju, was basically asking why wasn't President Yoon at the ceremony.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Right?
I did not see it.
So that's the attack.
But that's a perfect,
and so that's the attack that goes on, because we talk about some of the things that happen within Korea where there was clear fault of the Korean government. You have the May 15th Gwangju incident, right, where innocent people were, and
that's a very good analogy. Yeah,
and that's one of those things where you can ask, anybody. It is a dark part of history, and it is something that happened when the government at the time was, drunk with power. It was a military dictatorship at the time.
Yep.
And so no one is going to say that didn't happen, except for one person. He's now passed away, a very controversial figure who was leading that particular incident. And the Jeju incident is another one of those things.
Yeah.
Can we say that there are still lingering controversies or uncertainties surrounding the event, despite the fact that the vast majority of the Koreans do acknowledge, and the vast majority of the governments acknowledge the fault of the government then?
Yeah. I think there are two major controversies that we could talk about, and there are others if you're interested. But the major ones, of course, are the numbers. You'll see usually figures cited as a conservative estimate of around 20,000 people killed over those 14 to 16 months. And depending on who you talk to, those numbers may go higher. So again, that's not a small thing, because it tells you about the severity of the violence, particularly pre-Korean War. Remember, this was not in a declared war situation.
Right.
So this is a government on people situation. That's one. And the other one, again, is, of course, technically, if you're talking the spring of 48, you have not yet transitioned to the Sungman government. The American military occupation is in force. There are all kinds of questions about what did they know, why did they consciously or did they sort of actively or passively not acknowledge. They certainly think that things were going on. I want to be careful. I won't use the word consensus. I'll say I think the answer I would subscribe to is that they probably saw what the Sungman government saw, which was this is a communist uprising or some communist-inspired uprising. This needs to be suppressed. They did not think that we would still be talking about this many years later, because they saw this as a relatively probably minor blip in getting Korea ready. And they didn't know the Korean War was coming, of course.
Right, obviously.
Yeah.
There's also some people who place most of the blame towards the United States.
Yes, because, you could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on how you argue it.
Because what they argue is that even before, we've mentioned this in our previous episodes before, that even before the Korean War broke out, that there was already two Koreas, right? There was North Korea and South Korea. It was already split up.
Yeah, you have two zones of occupation that are meant to be temporary, and temporary turns out to be
permanent at this time.
Rather long.
Yeah, it's been going on for a very, very long time now.
Yes.
But when it was sort of split, and North Korea and South Korea was split, obviously North Korea kind of being under the control of this, or I should say, being under high influence, heavy influence of the Soviet Union.
Sure. In the same way that the South was at the beginning, heavily under the U.S., and then that.
Yeah. And so because the South was heavily under the influence of the United States, and the consensus is that Lee Seung-man being sort of on the U.S. side, right, handpicked candidate by the United States. You can say that. I mean, it was
that he was acting fully with the knowledge and possibly support of the United States. Yes, you can make this argument.
There's people that say that. I mean, they handpicked him, and he's someone that was chosen. And maybe, and I'm not saying this is the fact right now. There are some people who are saying that it was the United States who called on Lee Seung-man to do this. There are people.
I was going to say there's no documentary evidence that I know of.
No, there isn't.
But yes, you can, and yes, there are people who will. That's the more extreme form of the narrative. But yes,
and so that's the frustrating part.
I think they're looking for an acknowledgement from the United States in the same way that Korean governments have acknowledged.
Yeah, that there was. We can't say that there was they're 100% fault, right? Fault here.
But that you could have some recognition that this happened and we actually apologize for our role in it.
I want to know how this kind of event now be taught within Korea, and what should students learn about it today?
I have to be honest with you. I don't think there's a single answer, but I think it's a really good sign that we're living in a post-87 Korea where you can talk about this openly. I guess at the best level, I think that Korean students probably need to recognize and be taught more than the old version of the Korean War. It's just 50 to 53.
Yeah.
Expand the timeline. And I guess recognize, as we are trying to recognize here, that the Korea-U.S. relationship, because not assigning blame or in any way or the other, but that it was much more complicated, particularly pre-50, than you were able to acknowledge pre-87. That it is a friendly relationship. It is, generally speaking, a positive relationship, but that the U.S. and many times has, particularly at that time, had more power and sometimes did not always exercise that power in the most judicious fashion.
Well, there's still talks about that going on right now.
Yeah, I know. But I'm saying particularly then, 47, 48, 49, that sometimes the relationship was much more problematic.
I've always raised the importance of learning history. Right, I've always said, in order to learn a country, sure, it's important to learn about its culture and, music and food and things like that, but its history as well. But there's also, great deal of importance in learning history because every country has made mistakes in the past. Right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Some bigger than others, obviously. But to acknowledge their past mistakes, what that allows you to do is make sure that past mistake does not repeat itself, and that we don't see this.
Yeah, and then the openness and willingness to talk about it, as you said, and then at least, right, maybe if not repeated, at least if you do something silly again in the future, at least it's a little bit different, or at least you've accounted for it. You have mechanisms in place. That's what democratic institutions are supposed to be all about.
Yeah, and so I think that's the reason why there's still this incredible rift between South Korea and Japan, right? I mean, not just South Korea, but in North Korea too.
That history is is still very difficult to talk about. It's similarly dark heritage in many ways.
Yeah, and the acknowledgement of the past.
And to be fair, everything we're talking about, part of that also is because of the Cold War relationship between Korea and Japan. Weren't supposed to talk about tensions because they were both American allies.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, Professor Demoya, was a two-part series. Aaron, over in Philly, by the way, says one of my favorite segments. Glad I could log on this morning. For all our listeners out there, if you've ever missed any of our episodes for Made in Korea, that's actually available on our audio on demand. So AOD, it's available on our website, so you can check it out. Professor Demoya, thank you very much for your lessons today. Have a safe one, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you very much.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang Radio application, or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.